Recently, I had the pleasure of talking to Ted Gibson from his eponymous lab, TedLab at MIT, which researches why languages are the way they are, how people learn and process language, and the relationship between language and culture. In this interview, we talk about his work with numbers, colors, word order, and information theory across various languages, and his search for simplicity in explaining the complexity of language. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box below, where you will also find a link to his lab's website. I hope you enjoy it. So, Mr. Ted Gibson, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
No, it's very nice. It's my pleasure entirely.
I noticed on your website, on the website of your lab, it says that much of what we currently know about cognition is based on data from weird people. So that's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And I'm kind of wondering how you feel, that has affected the kind of study of linguistics in the past 50 years or 100 years.
Well, that's a very interesting question. This is that word "weird" is coined by Henrich at now he's at Harvard. He's Canadian. He's from I'm Canadian. He's like biased with knowing about Canadians. So he's from University of British Columbia. He was for many years, and Harvard hired him a few years ago. And so that's his label for the bias that's in the study of basically human anthropology of humans, how humans, whatever. I mean, I'm interested in the sort of high level cognition in language, but in he's interested in all aspects of human culture, and that's the bias there. That's in every field. Is it's towards people like me and you who live in industrialized countries, and we have democratic governments, and we're rich relative to many people in on the planet. And that's certain. I mean, I don't know how controversial that is to say that language research is very biased in that way. And so the way that language research has developed is it's always been I mean, certainly in the last 100 years it's been on Indo-European languages, and very biased towards Indo-European languages, and especially of course English. In the last 50 or 75 years it's been very Anglo-centric. And so I mean, many, sort of the Chomskyan program, for example, is very Anglo-centric. It was very Anglo-centric how it started, and so you have to wonder what percentage of the generalizations that people are talking about are driven by a few languages as opposed to many languages around the world. And so we mostly just don't know the answer to that, because there's very few studies of many languages from around the world. And so that's been a research topic for me in part, and many people, I guess now in the last 10 or 15 years, research groups have been trying to push towards studying more. I mean, I think everyone universally agrees on this, that we need to, if we care about human language in general, then we can't just study English and French and German, or even Chinese and Japanese, which are very different language families, but they're still from very similar cultures. I mean, they're different cultures actually than at least American and European cultures, but they're still they're similar in many ways in terms of industrialization is very similar. And so you need to explore a wider range of languages from a wider distribution of cultures. And so I've been lucky in some ways to be able to work with some people who work on more remote languages in South America. So I worked a little bit with Dan Everett, who worked with the Pirahã for many years. He was a missionary and anthropologist working on that language for 30 years. And so I was able to, at the very end of his sort of career, working with them, to go and visit there. And then after that, some little work that we did there led into studying a different group close by geographically, but of course it's an entirely different language called the Chimani, which is in Bolivia as opposed to Brazil, and also in the Amazonian basin. And so those languages, well, first of all, they're both isolates. So we don't know of any related languages to those. There's just they must be related somewhere far back, but within the last 200 years, there's nothing that's close. And culturally, they're both, well, the Piraha are true hunter-gatherers, and the Chimani are what are called farmer-foragers, which is sort of the next step up from hunter-gatherers. They do a little bit of farming, but the farming is kind of like the farming that I could do if I were going to farm in my backyard. So it's very little farming. I grow a little bit for my family. I don't farm a big field with oxen or something like that. They don't have cows, and so they would just farm a little bit of something, which is more than the Pirahan do. So Pirahan don't do that at all. They would just do hunting and gathering, meaning they just catch what they catch in the forest, and they eat a lot of fish. And so it's interesting to try and figure out how those kinds of cultures, which are very different from industrialized cultures, might affect the higher level cognition, which is language, and other aspects of cognition. I've also been exploring how number cognition works in both of those groups, and so how we count, for example. And it turns out the Piraha don't count. They don't have any words for any counting at all, not even a word for one, and that's pretty fascinating. The Chimani do. The Chimani have count words, but the culture isn't so different from the Piraha. So unsurprisingly, in some sense, the words are acquired much later than in industrialized cultures. And there's so instead of learning the words as in English, in sort of American English, or there's big socioeconomic status differences among English, but it's only a few months. That's typically a few months, and so kids will usually learn how to count. Counting is like, there's multiple senses of what we mean by counting, right? So first of all, knowing the list is one thing. So you can ask a parent of a 2-year-old, does your child know how to count? And they'll often say yes. But what that usually means is they know the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on, but they don't necessarily know what they mean. And so there's a nice task which was developed by Karen Wynn at Yale University, about 1992, was called the give-n task, where you have to give the appropriate number of objects to the experimenter, okay, to the parent or something. So if I say, you give me 2 or give me 3, you have a whole bunch of coins which are identical, and I ask you to give me 3. And a child who understands what 3 means will give you the right number. There's kids who know what the whole count list are, the full count list is from 1 to 10, who don't know how to do any of those things. So they're called zero knowers. They know the list, but they don't know what even 1 means. Then kids go through and reliably go through a stage where they know what 1 means. So they give 1 and nothing else. They might give a handful for any other number. And then they go through a stage where they understand what 2 is, 1 and 2. And then they'll know what 1, 2, and 3 are, each one of those, but nothing else. And those are called 1, 2, and 3 knowers. And sometimes you get 4 knowers, kids who understand what 1, 2, 3, and 4 are, but nothing more. But you never find a 5 knower. So there's no kid who knows what 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are, and doesn't also know what 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are. There aren't any kids like this. And so there's some interesting learning stage, which is what Karen Wynn discovered, that there's 1, 2, and 3 knowers, sometimes 4 knowers, but then they understand counting. They call it the cardinal principle, is what they're called. CP knowers is somehow that's called. I tend not to like that term, but because it implies some sort of deep knowledge of counting, which they may not actually have. They have some understanding of this task, and then they understand how to do the task on any number up to 10, say. Anyway, the Chimani, interesting feature about the Chimani is kids in the United States or in Russia or in Japan will learn this list at around 2, like not just the list, the meanings of the list at around 3. Sort of it's between 3 and 4 is typically normal. Early 3s usually. And in Chimani, it's around 8. So it's 5 years later, 4.5, 5 years later. And so they go through exactly the same stages. You can find 1, 2, 3 knowers, sometimes 4 knowers, but no 5 knowers. And yet but they're just going through far later. And what that means is that it suggests very strongly that the meanings of the words aren't innate. It's probably just about the usage or in their exposure, how often these numbers are used with meaning, and our cultures are so different, right? So our culture is so different from the Chimani's culture that yes, they do have numbers, but they just don't use them, don't count things very often. In U.S. English, parents constantly talk about numbers to their kids and the meanings associated with those. And we actually see big socioeconomic status differences within the United States. There, it's only a few months, though. We're talking about usually, 3.5 moves out to 4 with low SES, meaning less. What happens with low SES is typically they just don't speak as much to their children about anything, but including numbers. There's just less data for them to learn from.
I know that apart from numbers, you've also done some work on colors in these, in these kind of remote communities. So how does their cognition deal with colors in a different way?
There's the long history of studying words for colors in the field of language, and so it's really became most prominent through Berlin and Kay. So there's a guy called Brent Berlin and Paul Kay who were at UC Berkeley in the 70s, 60s, and 60s, and they observed. I guess it had been observed before them. They are not the first ones to observe that there are cultures, languages, but cultures vary in the number of words that they use for colors. And so, in English and in industrialized cultures, there's at least 11 words that everyone knows. And those are black, white, red, green, yellow, blue, brown, orange, pink, purple, and gray. I don't know if I got 11 there, but that was around 11. And so at least that everyone knows in English. And then in some languages, in industrialized cultures, there's even one more or two more or something. And so in Russian, it's well known there's two blues. There's a light and dark blue that everyone knows. And that's true in actually South American Spanish, and at least in Bolivian Spanish, where I worked a lot in Bolivia, there's two different blues. And so that's like, and so the Berlin K called, they call there's a light and dark blue. It's so celeste and azul. If you speak Spanish, right? So you're in Spain.
I did, but I didn't know that.
No, Spanish people from Spain are totally shocked by this, and also Mexicans. I had a Mexican student working with me, and this year I had a Spanish from Spain student working there, and they just think this is wrong. That no, you should say for these very light blues, they think those are azul, right? But no, that's celeste, which is of course means sky, right? It means sky or sky-like or sky. But that is the word that is just the origin of all color terms comes at some point from a thing which has that color. So the word orange, famously, is from the fruit. That's where the color term comes from. Many people don't know that, but the color term comes from the fruit that came first. And so celeste, presumably the origin of that is from the sky, but it has a lot of light blues and light greens associated with it. This is the South American, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say so. It's Bolivian Spanish. I don't know if it's true in Peru or in Argentina or anything, but it's definitely Bolivia. Everyone has this term. And anyway, but fascinatingly, in non-industrialized cultures, there's many fewer. And so to as few as two. And so there are communities around the world with only two, just mean just black and white, just have not really dark and light either. They're really black and white. And then if there's a third word, it's always red. And then what Berlin and Kay observed in the 70s, 60s, was that in the sample of languages that they looked at, which was 20 languages that they were able to get access to in the San Francisco Bay Area, they were at Berkeley, where they could get informants who spoke these different languages, that if a language had three terms, always black, white, and red. If there was a fourth, it was always the equivalent of the English green or yellow. If it was a fifth, it was the other of green or yellow. If it was a sixth, always blue, and so on, meaning there was a total order in the way that terms seemed to come into a language relative to any industrialized language they knew, so like English as baseline. So that seemed fascinating, and they hypothesized that there is a salience universal of how basically the visual system works, how vision works, how either the vision in the eye or vision connecting to the brain works, so that black, white, and red are the most salient, easy to see colors for humans, and then yellow and green equally, and then blue, and so on. There's some way of dividing up the color space such that those things are the most salient, easiest easiest to see. And then later terms come in because they're less obvious for the visual system. And so they were working with that hypothesis because of this total order, and they gathered much more data. So they went to 110 languages around the world, all remote, relatively remote languages, none of them industrialized cultures. And they had an anthropologist or a missionary at each one of those communities work with them indirectly and gather data from 25 to 30 speakers in each one of these communities. Really quite an incredible project. The data are available on the Berkeley website to this day. They're lovely data where you just get, you're given a different color chip of 330 of these different color chips, and you're asked, each participant is asked what you would label that in your language. And those raw data are available. And what they were hoping to find was this total order of how the color space, so the colors that they asked about were colors evenly spaced perceptually over the color space. You can basically think of color, there's many different ways of thinking of color. We actually don't know, it's not, people don't understand this, but we don't actually know how color vision works still, really. And we don't know how color perception quite works. So this is one color space. It's called the Munsell color space. This guy Munsell was a visual psychophysicist from the turn of the last century, around 1900. And he figured out one method of dividing up the color space such that in his space, up and down, there's a three-dimensional space. Up and down is the pole, the north-south pole, right down the center of this sort of sphere. It's not really a sphere; it's an off-center object. Anyway, that thing, you got white on the north pole and black on the south pole in this space, and then around the surface, on the surface of this unbalanced sort of sphere, it's not really a sphere, are the brightest colors. And around the equator is what you have, the color wheel is basically on the equator. But as you go up, you get bright, lighter colors of whatever's on the color wheel. As you go down, you get darker versions. And as you go to the center of the sphere, you get gray. You get the grays, the dull colors, okay? And so you have the achromatic ones right down the center of the pole of this sphere. And so this guy devised this sphere, this sort of sphere, because it's like not a center thing, based on the perception, him doing visual perception experiments. And the World Color Survey used his space. There are other spaces. There are other color spaces out there. This is not the only one. There's a French group called CIE, which is not quite the same as this, and it's working on, instead of the method for gathering the data isn't quite the same. They're similar, but they're not the same. We actually don't know exactly how color is perceived in humans quite. We know how the vision works. We know how but we don't know the perception, how that exactly works. Anyway, so this guy had these people in the World Color Survey got Munsell space, 330 of these chips on the outside of this sphere, equally spaced. So where spacing between the two chips is determined by how similar these things look. If you have normal vision, you have normal trichromatic vision. You've got three cones that such that you can see colors, and normal people have that. About 7% of men don't. They are green, red, colorblind, but most people can see all those. And if you do, then you can see literally millions of distinct colors. And so what Munsell did was figure out ways to rate the similarity of these colors, and devised a set of pigments, which are like paints, which are spaced across the visual perceptual space. That's what he figured out. And then the World Color Survey people said, we'll take evenly spaced version of some set of those, and it was around 320, actually 320, and then there was 10 right up and down the pole they took as well, so 330 total, and then just ask people to label those things. And so that's what he did. That's what Berlin and Kay did. And they didn't find what they thought they would find, which was there's a total order. In fact, they didn't actually find that. What they sort of talk about that still since, but it's very, very messy. The data from their original experiment are much from these 300 from the original 20 languages, blowing up to these extra 110, which are all non-industrialized cultures. You still see that if a language has everyone's got black and white. There's always a word for black. There's always a word for white, and if there's a word for if there's a third word, it's always corresponding to English red. But after that, it's very messy. There's nothing there's lots of spaces which don't have any, yellow doesn't come in early. Yellow, so Chimani is a great example. Yellow hasn't really come in there. It has at least 3, but it has, probably 5 or 6 words that most people know, and yellow is just not one of them. It's not a word in there. It should be early in this space. It isn't. And so there's a lot, and what the spaces look like or sometimes don't correspond very well to English colors. And so there's a concern there about, well, I mean, I wonder if what they were looking at originally comes back to your question at the very beginning, is that maybe there's some Anglocentricity associated with asking this question to bilinguals. Everyone was a bilingual in that original data set. It was 20 languages, but they all spoke English as well. And so there may be some spillover from knowledge of English or knowledge of some other language into the native language. Whereas you go to these, they're great data set, the World Color Survey, it is mostly monolingual speakers of each of these 110 languages. And you don't see such the exact sort of English correspondence so much.
No, I'm really surprised when it seems like, based on the original data, it seems that there's always black and white to begin with, which I'm kind of surprised about, because, in nature, there's not a lot of things which are kind of pure black and pure white. So you would think that maybe a more natural color, like a color that occurs in nature, like, I don't know, green or brown, would be first.
Well, that's a very interesting. I mean, it's a very interesting question. Is about why black and white. I have some speculation about that, but you're interesting. But just to get back to it, we've only talked about one of the hypotheses so far, which is the original Berlin and Kay, which is kind of salience, which is kind of not far off from what you're getting at. And it's actually different from what you're saying. I think what you're saying is much closer to our hypothesis, which is about use, sort of a usefulness. So when we start thinking about why do we have words at all? Why do any human languages have words? Like, what is the point of a word? And so is it, it's an interesting, deep question, actually. And so a plausible answer to that question, a very simple, maybe simplistic answer to that question, is that we have a word when we want to, I mean, depending on what we're talking about, I need to tell someone else, if it's about language, is about communication to some degree, then I need to tell someone else about something that I'm thinking about. And so if we're talking about color, why do we have color words? Those are properties of objects as opposed to objects themselves. And so why do I have, under this hypothesis, that's because I might have multiple objects of exactly the same color, such that I need to tell you which one I'm referring to, the red one and not the black one, or the black one and not the white one. And this kind of, that's when I need a word. So under the communication-based hypothesis idea. So it's not that we can't, so it's very different from the perceptual base. The perceptual thing is about, I see something and I think there's something perceptually interesting and salient about it, and I create a word for it, not because I want to tell you about two things which differentiate on that color, just because I find the color interesting or something. That's the perceptual hypothesis. And so you're talking about, this very, so under the use space hypothesis, which was our hypothesis, it's not actually obvious that green and brown, even though they're the most common things, would be the first words to come out, because under the use space hypothesis, I would need two objects which are identical except for color, such that I need to tell you about, oh, it's the green one, not the brown one. Well, there's not very many things that are identical except for green and brown in the world. I mean, you might think, oh, a banana is a great example of that, actually, where a banana can go from green to yellow to brown. And that's actually very common in most of these hunter-gatherer kinds of communities that I'm exposed to in South America. But the issue there, the problem there, is that color isn't the only thing that's changing when you change the color of a banana. You're changing its usefulness, actually. You're changing it from an unripe thing to a ripe thing to a rotten thing, and so you might easily imagine the use there is not, I mean, the color is correlated with the use, but we could easily talk about the actual use itself, like what the taste is and whether I want to eat it or not. That is correlated.
It kind of just blew my mind a little bit, actually, to think about the fact that in language we sort of create words for things, right, that we need to talk about, and objects are kind of things, but But as you said, colors, they're more like an extra. They're not actually really necessary, are they, to talk about a thing? That's really, that blew my mind.
Well, it's fascinating you say that because they are necessary in our world. In your world and my world, which is the industrialized world, they're absolutely necessary because almost everything that we interact with is of an arbitrary color because we like color. Humans like to look at color, and then if we dye things all these different colors, and so then I can have a shirt which is red or purple or gray or very different subtle shades. So you go to a paint store, you go to what we would have here is like Home Depot or Lowe's, these giant uh, do-it-yourself kinds of stores which have thousands of different colors, and they all have different labels because that's important. I need to be able to convey to you in a word, not by showing you a picture, because I have to somehow get that across I have to tell you somehow what that is. And so now there's, I don't know, 200 different yellows and oranges and browns and greens. And I have to, so depending on what your job is, if you are a painter or if you are a home designer, then you may know hundreds of words for colors as opposed to I know more than 11 because there's, I know a few more than just the 11 that a child knows. But you need those depending on what the job is that you're doing. If you're in fashion, you need that, right? That's like, what is fashion? It's a texture and it's color, and it's of course there's shape as well. These things are very important to humans. These are like what looks good to us. uh, has a huge component of that is color. And so then the more you're in the fashion industry, the more you care about color and you need more words. Well, if you're in a hunter-gatherer community or a farmer-forager community, these things just do not come up. Like, this is just not, you can't change your environment in this way. You don't have arbitrary colors to any objects. Everything is kind of given to you by the natural environment. And so uh, it's it's not, that's it may be slightly overstated because they do have, for example, industrialized clothing, but the industrialized clothing is not obtained in the same way as we obtain industrialized clothing. They don't go to a store where they can choose whatever color they want. The clothing they get is really happenstance in some weird way, such that it gets given to them by someone got it somewhere, and it gets passed on in some way. They don't have a lot of choice about color or shape or stuff like that. And so it's very different. So you don't need the words. So they see the same things we see, but there's, like, if you look at a sunset in South America, it's the same beautiful array of colors as it is here. It's just there's no reason to label those colors actually here or there. There's no reason. We can, but you don't have to, because I don't have two skies and I don't have to tell you which sky to look at. It's this color one or this one. No, there's only one of them, and we can just admire it, and there's not really any need for the words. It is fascinating. When people sort of start thinking about this for the first time, they realize that why do we have these words? It's, when I bring up this thing, is you really see millions, you see literally millions of colors. Why is it we only know 11 or 12? Or even if it's 20, even if you know 20, it's because that's all I need to get around in the world. And when you start looking at the variation in color that's actually there, you realize it's actually it's a hard problem, this categorization that we're doing.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this paper here. So, a noisy channel account of cross-linguistic word order variation.
Oh yeah, sure.
I think, well, I'm going to read. It says that we hypothesize that subject-object-verb or subject-verb-object variation can be explained by language users' sensitivity to the possibility of noise corrupting the linguistic signal. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think so. We think that's a pretty interesting hypothesis. It's like, so the idea is that this is, again, Shannon and information theory applied now to, instead of the word level, sort of to the sentence level of what's going on in communication. And so in some other work that we had done, we ended up providing some evidence that suggested that people were very sensitive to the possibility of deletions in in reading and in listening to language. Meaning that if I give you a sentence like, I'm going to say something crazy. I'm going to say, the ball kicked the girl. Okay, that really only means one thing, even though it means a really strange thing, right? It means a strange thing that means the girl is a patient. She's being kicked by a ball, which is very odd. And so you might have thought that I probably meant the girl kicked the ball, even though it's clear what I said. The ball kicked the girl. Now, consider another sentence which is equally weird in some way, which is if I say, John gave a book the girl. Okay, there, or I say, the boy gave a book the girl. There, it doesn't sound so weird at all, even though there's a sense in which that is completely strange, because what I literally said was, John gave a book the girl, and there's a double object construction in English, and therefore the girl is the object, and a book is the goal. And so therefore what I meant there was, I guess literally was, John gave the girl to some book, which is very odd. And that's a very strange thing to say. That's kind of plausibility wise as weird as balls kicking people. You don't give people to inanimate objects. That doesn't make any sense either. But for some reason, when people hear or read that second sentence, they happily process it as if I meant John gave a book to the girl. I never said to, but I didn't get the order of those things wrong. I didn't switch them. So for some reason, people are very happy to think I deleted. I just missed out a case marker. I missed out this preposition, and we showed this in a bunch of studies and across a few constructions that in English that people are very happy to process, strictly speaking, ungrammatical sentences in a very grammatical, or actually actually grammatical, but very implausible, according to another interpretation, which just makes much more sense in the world, but only if there's like a single deletion away. And so it seems like deletions are something that we expect are okay. Well, first of all, we should be painfully aware, even though people are mostly not, that language is a noisy communication system. Okay, so how do we know that language is noisy? Well, one thing, spoken communication is very noisy. I make all kinds of speech errors. Most people make all kinds. I just did a false start right there. I started to say something. I said the same word twice. This happens all the time, and I'll do it depending on what my state of mind is. I'll do more. The more nervous I am, the more errors I will make. People do this all the time. It's like, and how bad is this? Well, there's a term which is proofreading. What is proofreading? The term in English means we know we wrote it wrong and we want to find the errors in it. Even though we tried to make it right, I need to proofread this because I'm sure there's all kinds of my own errors in my own text, which I wrote down carefully. So language is just filled with errors. It's just the natural state of the world. And so we know this, though, as users of language. And so one of what we were trying to explore in one of these papers, but the one that sort of preceded this, was to see what kinds of errors are people okay with in a noisy channel. We know it's a noisy channel. That's Shannon again, this information theory. How is it noisy? Do we expect exchanges? Do we expect deletions? Do we expect insertions of random things? And no, it turns out that deletions are something that we are expecting a lot. As long as it's a low content thing, we might expect to lose that thing a lot of the time. And so given that, which is something we'd found, then we sought to think about word order across the world's languages. It turns out that there are, in very simple, people have studied the sort of simplistic version of word order across the world's languages in terms of the agent, the patient, and the verb. Okay, so sometimes people talk about the agent as the subject. Those aren't actually technically the same thing, but those things get thought of as very similar things. So in a sentence like the girl kicked the ball, the girl is the subject and the agent, and the ball is the object, and the patient and the verb is kicked in the middle there. And in English, we have a very biased word order to being subject or agent first, verb in the middle, and the objects are at the end. And that's a very common word order. Chinese has it, many African languages, lots of languages. It's about something like 40% of the languages of the world, depending on how you count. There are 7,000 languages around the world, but some very large percentage, 30 or 40%, have an SVO, subject, verb, object, word order. And then another extremely common, even more common than SVO, is SOV, verb final. And those are languages like Korean and Japanese, Turkish. There's, again, hundreds and hundreds of those, thousands of those around the world. It's a little bit more common than SVO. So SVO and SOV are the most common word orders by far. There are, in studies of word order, there's like some ambiguity. We just don't know about quite a lot of languages. We know about something of the word order from around 1,200 languages around of the 7,000, and of those, most of those are SOV or SVO. And so there's and then I can't say much. There's one other pretty common word order, which is called, it's verb subject object, VSO. It's not very common. It's around 10%. And then the rest are kind of mixed to the extent there's anything.
There also must be, but there also must be some languages where you can't even sort of, like agglutinative languages maybe, where it's sort of just like one huge word and there's not really the difference between, I don't know.
That's a very interesting general point, is how do you well, even if it's an agglutinative language, to the extent the languages are agglutinative, if there are separate words for things like nouns and verbs, like that, to the extent there are separate words for nouns and verbs, which is not obviously apparent in all of the world's languages, although in most it is true. Then where is the methodology of people who've studied this is like, well, where do you put the agenty thing, the noun agenty thing, relative to the verby thing? So ignoring the morphology, where do you put these things if they're going to be fully labeled? There's another whole question, maybe you're getting at, is that, many languages, if they have a lot of morphology, don't even, there's a lot of things that are pronominalized, and so you don't even need to say the nouns. But say in the first mention, what's the default way? This methodology is trying to study why, just trying to get some inkling out of what the possible word orders are across the world's languages. And so anyways, the two most common, I think, uncontroversially, are SOV and SVO, very much so. And VSO unquestionably, I think, is third. And then the others are just very, very rare, actually. The other possibilities like OVS or VOS or whatever I'm missing here is the other. There's one other I'm missing there, which would be OSV, I guess. So those are ones where subjects come after objects. And those are just very, very rare across the world's language. So agents typically come before patients as opposed to after patients, almost always. And that's plausibly because, this is an old story due to a guy called Brian McWhinney, who thought that, and it seems very plausible to me, is that, we as humans like to talk about other humans, and agents are usually human. They're usually ourselves, in fact, and we like to talk about ourselves, and we want to talk about other humans, and those things are easiest to talk about first. So we kind of would go with the most salient, obvious things first. Those are the humans, and then we go on from there. And then the subjects kind of have to come before the objects if there's some sort of cognitive universal based on animate, because the patient things are very often inanimate, things like a ball. In a girl kicked a ball. And so those things tend to come after. They're less important, salient to humans. And so we were wondering, so this noisy channel thing, we had this idea that maybe it might explain something about the world's languages, that languages tend to be either SVO or SOV, but when they're SOV, they're almost always case marked. And when they're SVO, they're rarely case marked. And so what is case marking? Case marking is this endings, morphological, usually a suffix, on a noun, which tells you whether it's an agent or a patient, whether it's a subject or an object. So a language like Latin, which has case marking, for example, will say the word boy differently if it's an agent, if it's a subject, or if it's an object. There'll be accusative on that's what it means to be an object, or for nominative case for the subject. And many languages, well, mostly SOV languages, have case marking, whereas SVO languages like English and French and Mandarin Chinese don't have any case marking. And we were trying to guess about why that might be. This is an old observation, actually, due to Joseph Greenberg. There's a neat observation that SOV languages tend to be case marked, SVO tend not to be. We thought maybe this has got to do with noisy channel communication, that if you have a SOV word order and you want to keep that SOV word order, there's you got to keep in mind here, there's a possibility of noise in the channel, meaning a lot of what it means about noise is maybe meaning I'll lose something. Remember, I told you the deletions are kind of most relevant here. And so I might lose a word here and there. And so maybe I want to talk about two animates, one animate acting on another animate, which happens a lot. We mostly talk about animates acting on inanimates, but we also talk about, say, a boy kissing a girl or a girl kissing a boy. That's an animate acting on another animate. And there, the word order is pretty important in English to say, if is it John kissed Mary or Mary kissed John? Those mean very different things, right? And so the boy, or in Japanese, which is a verb final language, the way you do that is you say the boy subject, nominative, the girl object, accusative, and then kissed. Okay, and say we are in a verb final language like Japanese, and I just don't hear something. Okay, you don't say it, and all I heard was boy kiss. Okay, so I didn't hear boy girl kiss, or I didn't hear girl boy kiss. All I heard was boy kiss. Then there's a possibility. I don't know now. I might not know if I'm a listener just coming into this conversation that whether the boy is the agent or the patient of that. I know the boy's involved in kissing, but I don't know if he's the agent or the patient because I just don't have enough information because all my nouns come before my verb and I don't know which one it is. Whereas in English, if I hear boy kiss, it's different from I hear kiss boy. Like those things sound different because of the orientation relative to the verb. The verb provides a kind of a centering point, because basically verbs and nouns aren't the same, right? So nouns are labeling things in the world. Typically verbs are telling how they're interacting. Here in English, we got the verb in between. And so that gives me a cue as to how boy is interacting in this event. Whereas in Japanese, I don't have that. And so the idea is that if you want to keep an SOV language, a nice way to keep that language, that word order, and there's like reasons to think that SOV is a really nice word order, actually a very easy word order for people to learn, independent if they didn't have any language before. So there's like a couple of case studies of these sign languages, which are basically born out of whole cloth. There's Nicaraguan Sign and El Bedouin Sign Language. These are both SOV languages. When they're created from home sign languages, they both somehow created a verb final language. And so there's something easy about verb final languages. There's this very cool paper by Susan Golden Meadow showing that no matter what native language you speak, people will tend to gesture meanings from that language. If you just now I'm like basically trying to make up a sign language to describe English. They'll gesture in SOV even though they speak SVO, which is pretty.
Boy, girl, kiss.
Exactly. Well, actually, that's an interesting case you just brought up with the boy girl, but with boy girl, it's boy ball kick they will do. So if it's inanimate object, when it becomes two animates, then gets much messier. But if it's an animate acting on an inanimate, then they will tend to gesture the verb at the end, almost very, very, very robustly.
Wow, it's so weird because you're right, when I think about sort of acting it out with gestures, it does make sense to sort of like, you and then the ball and then kick, but but as an English native speaker, it kind of it feels weird to me to the idea of constructing a sentence where you have your two kind of your two objects and then or your subject object and then the verb. It kind of feels weird to me, but that's just because I'm a native speaker.
Yeah, you're a native speaker of English, but even so, you might gesture. I mean, I bet if you were naive in this experiment, you would actually probably gesture verb finally on these cases because it's very robust. It's like 90% of the trials in hers and our replication. We did these things as well from Susan Golden Meadow's work. It's very robust, I think. But so that's just to say that SOV is a very natural word order for humans. It's a natural word order. And so if you want to keep that natural word order under the noisy channel hypothesis, it turns out that case marking is a great way to do it. It's like a way to have a redundant cue as to what I mean. When I say, boy, I say, oh, nominative. And so even if you lose the other thing, okay, this person's the agent. So it's like a redundant cue to tell you how to interpret this noun. And I need those under the noisy channel hypothesis more for verb final languages, just because deletion is a thing that I have to deal with in normal communication. And so it turns out that works very nicely to explain a lot about world's languages, in that, as I say, there's this lovely generalization which was unexplained by Greenberg, which is SVO tend not to be case marked, no endings on them. So English is a lovely case of Old English used to be, it comes very close to German. And German, as I'm sure you know, is very case marked. And so German is underlyingly, people think, SOV. It's got certainly a lot of verb final structures in it. English used to be like that. And as English had language contact, Old English had language contact with French, and it lost its case marking. And as it lost its case marking, it also lost its verb finalness. So it's hard to know which one caused which, but it went verb medial and lost case marking entirely. So it went from German. So once you go verb medial, you don't need case marking anyway. And sweet people just drop that. It just goes away. And so that's kind of just like a case study in the observation that if it turns out that's just like, almost all verb final languages are case marked and have a lot of endings. And almost, I shouldn't say, it's not so much true in the other direction. There are examples of SVO languages with lots of case marking, and Russian's one of them. So Russian's a lovely language where it tends to be SVO and has lots of case marking. So that just means it's a very redundant communication system. It's basically very robust to communication under this hypothesis. It's the other direction, which will be a little weirder, if you can find verb final languages with no case marking. And I don't know of any of those. They probably exist. There's always exceptions to things, I think, or often. I mean, I don't know about this. This is not this is the kind of case where I would expect exceptions, because it's just a case of like a general tendency, a sort of a hypothesis about how languages are changing to make communication easier. And the thing is about any of that kind of hypothesis is there's many things that make language easier or harder. And so there's tons of, in some sense, one of the first things I talked about was this sort of word length, word predictability correlation. It's not perfect. So in some sense, there's many exceptions to that at the word level. So there's many short words which are very, very low frequency and even aren't very predictable. A word like ox is like very low, very short word, and also pretty low frequency now. Data are complicated in real languages, and so there's like many factors predicting, explaining why any one thing is the way it is. And so you're going to find tons of exceptions. There's a general case there across every language, though, that word length is very correlated with word predictability. Here, I think there's going to be a general case such that you're going to have less case marking as you have more verb final regularity. But I know that less for sure than I know about the other hypothesis.
I think maybe the reason I find it interesting is because you're sort of applying computer science, which is very, it's a very hard science. It's like right or wrong, and you're taking something like human language, which there's like culture and psychology, and it's messy, really messy, and trying to sort of reconcile those two things. Maybe that's the fascination, because it's just so difficult.
Yeah, I guess I have this sort of bias that it's all these things are going to turn out kind of simple at some level, and so I keep, whenever the solution that's been proposed is really complicated, I sort of don't believe it. I think maybe there's an easier solution, because the solutions I'm giving you are pretty easy, actually. They're pretty simple to say. Like, there's a little bit of math. It's true. It's a little bit. There's a bit of math, but the math is like not. There's words that you can use to say what's going on in that math. So it's like, oh, that's all that is. And so it's really, as soon as things get a little unwieldy, I worry that it's wrong. That I have a huge simplicity bias towards for language. And so that's the fact that I guess I like to work on it, because I felt like that wasn't the case when I started in this field. That wasn't the case at all. And so I thought, oh, this is a place where I can apply some neat skills, math, computer science skills, to somewhere that probably has solutions like that. Eventually someone will start figuring them out. And so I want to do that. I want to try Anyway.
It was a really fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for your time. I know that you're a busy guy.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's been very enjoyable talking to you. I hope you can use some of this.